What's up? I am David Long. I'm here today to share with you a clip from my recent video about soul, self, awakening, ghosts, afterlife, and reincarnation. I'll have links for you at the end for the full length, and you can also check for links down below. I'm just gonna dive right into it. I might have to come back through and, sort of one at a time deal with some of these issues like reincarnation or whatever, but I'm just gonna start by telling you my position. Really, a lot of this comes back to this idea of what is consciousness, and there are different worldviews that deal with this differently. For example, the two schools of thought are the idealistic and materialistic cosmologies. Now, when I say idealistic and materialistic in this way, I don't mean it like,
I've been dreaming of a true love's kiss.
oh, you're so idealistic, or like,
just in case you think some twin is in this motherfucker.
oh, you're so materialistic. I mean it like, there are some people who think that the world arises in consciousness, so the world is built of ideas. The more materialistic worldview is this notion that consciousness is something that emerges within the materialistic world. It's sort of a byproduct of matter. It's not the source of matter, but in fact matter is the source of consciousness. For the most part, this idealistic view about the world happening in consciousness is outdated and unfounded. It's mostly a religious idea and a new agey idea. There are not many scholarly cosmologists who take it seriously. If you look at the way that functions correlate to equipment, we can see the development of consciousness through time. It's interesting to see how often idealists of all types of varieties will project the fruits of evolution as the source of evolution. For example, intelligence or consciousness or love and purpose, all these things that have evolved over time, where we can map the development and understand all of those things pretty well given materialistic explanations. And they'll say that all of these things have arisen in time because of consciousness, or because of intelligence and design, or because of love and compassion at the source of it all. Like, logically, I think there's some major problems just in the basic foundations of it. It's kind of like arguing that the internet pulled itself into being, and that every single microchip that has ever existed or been invented came from the internet at the source of everything that willed itself into being. Now, on the materialist side, it's interesting to see that there's a lot of different arguments about what's going on in the universe too. So even if you think that reality is a closed system or somehow cycling on itself or filtering around or whatever, there are a bunch of different explanations for that. There's like this idea of the Big Bang, Big Crunch. Some people think that the Big Bang maybe was the other side of a black hole. That's kind of an interesting thought. Maybe there's further and further Holons out. Who knows? Here's the interesting difference between the two camps. The idealist camps are making unfounded claims. They are qualifying the unqualifiable, making claims about things which no one could ever know or ever measure, whereas the emergentist camps are making fact claims based on all of the data that we've collected about evolution through time and our knowledge about what has actually happened in history, where we have figured out an actual coherent and valid meta-theory that has the explanatory power and doesn't postulate outside entities as explanations. So I think that's the main reason why most reasonable people go with the emergentist view. This idea of an individual soul is an outdated concept. It comes from a time before we understood the micro and macro scales of reality, before we understood our place in the world. Back then people had this kind of three-layer cake understanding of reality, where there was the heavens above, the underworld below, and we were somewhere in the middle. Now, with science, we have a whole new view of our place in reality. We're no longer in this kind of three-layer cake, or all these different scales of reality. And we find that there's life on different scales of reality. Like, not only are we on this planet, in a solar system, in a galaxy far, far away with other galaxies, just this tiny little speck, but even we are kind of like a universe unto ourselves, with a whole bunch of different cells and small microbioorganisms, bacterias, and all kinds of stuff. I mean, some of you people are really nasty, is what I'm trying to say. No. But what I'm getting at is that there's like a whole ecosystem of life happening in my mouth right now. Think about that for a minute. I mean, I need to go brush my teeth. But what I'm trying to say is, like, this is not an individual thing. That's an illusion. And now we understand that I am a part of a society. I am a part of an ecosystem. The bell tolls for thee, my friend. No man is an island. There is no such thing as an individual anywhere. Let me suggest this word called holons. I would not only encourage you to look this word up, I would encourage you to use it instead of the word individual. I would encourage you to correct people who use the word individual and teach them this word Holon. I would invite you to invite those people to watch this video. So the idea of the fractal and the Holon are also somewhat related. A Holon is something that is simultaneously a whole and a part. The word was coined by Arthur Koestler in his book The Ghost and the Machine. He figured out that although it's easy to identify subwholes or parts, wholes and parts in an absolute sense do not exist anywhere. So he proposed this word holon to describe the hybrid nature of subwholes and parts within living systems. From this perspective, holons exist simultaneously as self-contained wholes in relation to their subordinate parts, and as dependent parts when considered from the inverse direction. Holons are autonomous, self-reliant units that possess a degree of independence and handle contingencies without asking higher authorities for instructions. These holons are also simultaneously subject to control from one or more of these higher authorities. The first property ensures that the holons are stable forms in themselves that are able to withstand disturbances, while the latter property signifies that they are intermediate forms providing a context for the proper functionality of the larger whole. A holon is a system composed of other holons, and their structure exists at a balance point between order and chaos. Holons range in size from whatever the smallest particles are, all the way up to whatever the largest thing is, the multiverse. Individual humans and their societies and cultures are intermediate level holons, created by the interaction of forces working upon us both top down and bottom up. On a non-physical level, words, ideas, sounds, emotions, everything that can be identified is simultaneously a part of something and can be viewed as having parts of its own. Since a holon is embedded in larger wholes, it is influenced by and influences these larger wholes. And since a holon also contains subsystems or parts, it is similarly influenced by and influences these parts. Information flows bidirectionally between similar and larger systems, as well as rhizomatic contagion. When this bidirectionality of information flow and understanding of role is compromised, for whatever reason the system begins to break down. Wholes no longer recognize their dependence on their subsidiary parts, and parts no longer recognize the organizing authority of the wholes. Cancer may be understood as such a breakdown in the biological realm.
This idea of an individual, not only is it wrong, as we're talking about, but it's also potentially cancerous and dangerous. The problem with this idea of an individual is that it doesn't recognize its inherent connection to the larger whole and to the larger process. And so it starts living for itself, and that is where it becomes like a form of cancer. And not only will that not help the individual, that will lead to the breakdown of a culture and a society.
So a hierarchy of holons is called a holarchy. Now, being that we're at an intermediate place in this holarchy, the idea is that self is something that is both created from pressures coming from the top down and from the bottom up. So you could say, in some sense, from both nature and from nurture, from both our own biological impulses and drives coming up in our different states and whatever we might be going through on the inside, as well as top down coming from authority and culture and different ideas that are put upon us from the outside. And then these two forces come together to create whatever self we can manage in the moment.
Say this blanket represents all the matter and energy in the universe, okay? You, me, everything. Nothing has been left out, all right? All the particles, everything.
What's outside this blanket?
More blankets, that's the point.
Blanket's everything.
Exactly, this is everything, okay? Let's just say that this is me, right? And I'm, 60-odd years old, I'm wearing a gray suit, blah, blah, blah. And let's say over here, this is you, and you're, I don't know, you're 21, you've got dark hair, etc. And this is a war, and this is a museum, and this is a disease, and this is an orgasm, and this is a hammer.
Everything is the same, even if it's different.
Exactly. But our everyday mind forgets this. We think everything is separate, limited. I'm over here, you're over there, which is true. But it's not the whole truth, because we're all connected. Because we are connected.
Sure.
Okay?
Yeah.
All right, now, we need to learn how to see the blanket truth all the time, right in the everyday stuff.
Why?
Why what?
Why do I need to learn how to see the blanket thing all the time in the everyday stuff?
Well, you wouldn't want to miss out on the big picture, would you?
Uh-uh.
That's partly why you're here, right? And this is it. I'm talking about it right now. I mean, it'll take a while for you to get it, you know? But it'll help you.
I told you that he wasn't ready for infinity.
Hey, don't start with that magic blanket bullshit, okay?
It's not magic, it's just the way things are, Tommy. You and me in the air are actually tiny particles that are swirling around together. Look right here, you see?
Okay. Well, look at the cracks between these particles.
Look closer. There are tiny particles connecting the larger cubes.
Yeah, and then tinier cracks between the connections.
And even tinier connections.
And even tinier cracks.
Yeah, but if you look close enough, you can't tell where my nose ends and space begins because they're unified. See?
Back in the day, when we came up with this idea of an individual, we didn't really have an idea of an ecosystem per se. Nor did we understand cells and the fact that there are billions of lives that are happening in our body. Like, you know how they say that every 7 years we have a whole new body? I mean, that's the whole body. But all new cells, completely new cells every 7 years. I think it's like every 3 days for blood. So it's relative, but think about that I am literally a completely different person than I was 7 years ago. That's crazy. That's not really accurate. Part of my video making process is to do a peer review process once I'm done with the video. And after putting it out, it came back that this is actually not true. What's not true about it is that some bones take like 10 years, and certain cells never get remade. And I'll put links to a video about it below. But I think the general point still remains, that we're not the same person that we've been in the past, that we're not just this one thing, but we're in dynamic flux. Anyways, let's get back to the video. So when the smallest unit of life is a cell, and I am billions of cells in flux, does it make sense to think of myself as one life? And what about all those other cells? Do they have souls too? Why not? Are we just human-centric? Do we just think that humans are particularly special and there's something about being a human that gives us a soul? Well, maybe if you believe there's some kind of God or animating force that breathes that into us, but I don't see any reason to postulate any of that, and there certainly seems to be no real evidence for that. I mean, you have that story about the body releasing 21 grams at death or something, but that's not really good peer-reviewed science or anything like that, and just because the body loses some kind of mass doesn't necessarily correlate to any kind of a soul, because soul isn't something that can be physically measured like that, right? Otherwise we'd be able to physically measure it somewhere else, and we just haven't really found that ever anywhere. So am I saying that we're just reducible to stuff? Am I saying that we're just bags of chemicals? I would no more want to do that than I would want to reduce my computer to just a piece of hardware. I think there's a lot more going on, but I do think it is helpful to understand our new understanding of what we really are based on science. This is a perspective that people didn't have before in history, and I think putting that in context is real important to really understanding where this idea of a soul comes from.
Did you find the files?
I don't even know what they look. What do they look like?
They're in the computer.
They're in the computer?
Gotta figure it out.
In the computer. It's so simple.
Let's not lose our cool. Then we're no better than the machine.
We got 30 years worth of files right here in this computer. Damn!
Where'd all the files go?
One of the problems we have in discussing consciousness scientifically is that consciousness is irreducibly subjective. Consciousness is what it's like to be you. If there's an experiential, internal, qualitative dimension to any physical system, that is consciousness. And we can't reduce the experiential side to talk of information processing and neurotransmitters and states of the brain. People want to do this. Someone like Francis Crick said famously, "You're nothing but a pack of neurons." And that misses the fact that half of the reality we're talking about is the qualitative, experiential side. So when you're trying to study human consciousness, for instance, by looking at states of the brain, all you can do is correlate experiential changes with changes in brain states. But no matter how tight these correlations become, that never gives you license to throw out the first-person experiential side. That'd be analogous to saying that if you just flipped a coin long enough, you would realize it had only one side. And now it's true you can be committed to talking about just one side. You can say that heads being up is just a case of tails being down. But that doesn't actually reduce one side of reality to the other. And to give you a more precise example, we have very strong third-person, quote, objective measures of things like anxiety and fear. You bring someone to the lab, they say they're feeling fear, you can scan their brains with fMRI and see that their amygdala response is heightened. You can measure the sweat on their palms and see that there's an increased galvanic skin response. You can check their blood cortisol and see that it's spiking. These now are considered objective third-person measures of fear. But if half the people came into the lab tomorrow and said they were feeling fear and showed none of these signs, and they said they were completely calm when their cortisol spiked and when their palms started to sweat, these objective measures would no longer be reliable measures of fear. So the cash value of a change in physiology is still a change in the first-person conscious side of things. And we're inevitably going to rely on people's subjective reports to understand whether our correlations are accurate. So the hope that we're going to talk about consciousness shorn of any kind of qualitative, internal, experiential language, I think is a false one. So we have to understand both sides of it, classically subjective and objective.
So where is David? What is that? What is this self, if it's not some kind of a intangible essence that floats off after I die and lives on somehow? Well, I would say that David is an idea. It's something that I'm indoctrinated into. It's a mythology that's built around this body mind. It gets named David by my parents, and then I'm told I am David. and that David's expected to do all these things. Me and my friend Kevin, we made this video about George Herbert Mead. I would suggest you check it out. We don't have the annotations and the links like we used to anymore, where I could point to things and be like, go click here. So check for links down below.
I was looking at this book, Mind, Self, and Society, George Herbert Mead, and I was saying, Kevin, this book is talking about this development of a self as a concept with language. Mead, his important concept is symbolic interaction, that there's constantly a process of interpretation and narrative construction that goes on within the individual, that they're constantly creating a world and reacting to that world and reacting to others through this constant interpretation, this linguistically mediated perspective taking. That's
Right.
where the term comes from. And then through this linguistically mediated perspective taking, we have the potential for the construction of a world, because we're in some sense in Indra's net of meaning. There are all these people who you need things from, whether it's love or food, whatever you happen to need or want, and this happens before you can conceptualize the need or want. You yearn, you see the eyes of your mother, you form attachments, way before you think, this is what Kevin would do, or man, I'm hungry. You just feel these needs, and then you're able, through these connections with other people, through learning language, through yearning to learn, to express to others these needs and these wants and these feelings, you're able to hang these on the hooks of language, and you continue to be pulled into the structures of society and meaning. And you form a narrative self who you talk to, you speak to yourself, and this is something that constantly, and part of the reason that we're social animals is that this narrative self requires fairly regular replenishing. You need to coordinate this clock of yourself. Like, you begin to unravel after a certain time in solitary confinement, because there's no one to confirm that you are who and what you say that you are. All you have is you to talk to, and without a coordinating of the clock of the self, that self-talk becomes a real mess. The me and the I get confused, and there's no mental content that you can feel is something objective to hold on to, and you see dramatic deterioration of people's neural pathways as well as their cohesive thoughts about themselves. Mead's focus on the process of linguistically mediated perspective taking, of the pragmatic construction of the self, not just merely an expression of a self that was always there. Mead is going to be saying that there's an important element that's overlooked by a lot of other social scientists and philosophers, and that element is how the interpreting narrative self is constructed and how that self comes to talk to itself, creating a constant stream of interpretation that is the self. And it's not that there's this concrete narrative that the person consciously is aware of. They're not like, well, I've got this cluster of David thoughts that I carry with me that never changes, or this bubble of a self that's a concept that I always am touching. But rather, it becomes a character, and this backstory to a character, like you're a friend that you know. Right. You're a friend that you know. Mm-hmm. And this is his concept of the me and the I. Is the me is the narrative self, the story that you tell yourself about yourself, and the self that you talk to as the I. The I, the reflecting self. There's the reflecting self and the narrative self. And the I is this reflecting self that is occasionally surfaces where there's trouble, like when Heidegger says when the hammer breaks. Like, the hammer isn't apparent to you until it stops working. It's just an object that you're using in the moment, not even thinking about it when you're familiar enough with it, when you're conscious enough with it. And that's what I think is the deal with consciousness generally. Is like, we're not babies struggling to understand language unless we're learning a new language. We're not trying to... We're just feeling those words, and they're coming out seamlessly through the vehicle. Right, and this is why when you bring philosophy up, like linguistic philosophy or interpretation or questions of being to other people, they look at you like you're a lunatic, because they're like, well, of course it is this, or whatever, like they just assume that language is this objective thing that no one really needs to think about because it just expresses what is, rather than framing and shaping our experience of the world. Right. So like, we're all caught in our own little meaning matrices. Right. So we're like trying to understand the world from a perspective that we think of as objective because we don't have any distance from it. Right. And it's only in those moments where words fail, or where you're trying to learn another language, or you're trying to express thoughts in words that you don't have, that you realize how contingent language is, how embedded meaning is.
You have several stories that you like to tell over and over and over and over.
Oh, that's not... Come on, that's a lot.
May 18th, sales meeting.
Shania's there. Promoting her apparel, right? 4 o'clock, she's starving. She hates mayonnaise, right? Allergic to it. So I ordered her a ton of tuna fish sandwiches. Back then, that's all she's eating. Tuna fish. No mayo, darling.
June 5th, driving range.
No joke. We gave her a chicken salad sandwich once. She threw up in the back of the limo.
June 30th, the lake.
Shania's there, promoting her apparel, right? 4 o'clock, she's starving. She's a busy lady. So I ordered a ton of tuna fish sandwiches. That's all she's eating back then, tuna fish.
July 9th, flight 27 to Chicago.
Shania's there promoting her apparel, right? She now eats 1.5. Now she believes me. She eats 1.5 sandwiches before she realizes it's chicken salad.
Why do you think that you tell the Mayo story so much?
I don't know why.
It's propaganda.
For mayonnaise.
for you.
Specifically, you're so impressive because you know Shania, and you're so strong because you pull one on her.
You're a funny guy, a good guy.
Keeping everyone laughing so that maybe, quote, you don't get depressed.
So what's so great about depression?
Nothing. Unless it holds the key to something you compulsively avoid, so it'll never be examined or felt. Hence your behavior becomes repetitive, like the story.
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 All right. I don't have to tell stories.
What do you think would happen if you didn't tell the stories? Are you being yourself?
How am I not myself?
How am I not myself?
Myself. Myself.
How am I not myself?
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 How am I not myself? How am I not myself?
How am I not myself? How am I not myself?
How am I not myself? How am I not myself? How am I not myself? How am I not myself? How am I not myself? How am I not myself?
Self is this kind of performance for others, and that's why we might rightly be a different person for our mom or for our dad than we are for our friends in a social environment, or who we are for our customers in a work environment. Self is not this one kind of simple thing. If you look at something like big mind practice, this type of psychological unpeeling of the onion, what he does is he goes through and gets you to take on all of these different voices within yourself and realize that they are all necessary and essential, and he gets you to speak from each of these perspectives. There's the protector and the skeptic and the voice of fear, so on and so on. And all of these are kinds of like layers that protect this underlying vulnerable child.
What we're going to do is we're going to dissect the self today. Now, there's a reason to dissect something, and that is to learn more about it. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to dissect the self in order to learn more about the self, in order to study the self, in order to transcend the self. Have any of you thought about questions such as, who am I? Or what is my true self? Or what is my true nature? I'm seeing a lot of bobbing heads. Yes. What we're going to do is we're going to be looking at that today. And we're going to be discovering why it is so difficult somehow to grasp that. Why it's so difficult to put our hands or fingers on who I really am. We can all come up with what I do. You know, I'm a mother, I'm a father, I'm a grandparent, I'm a son, I'm a daughter, I work in this field, I'm a teacher, or whatever. But when we get into the questions of who am I really, we're really thrown for a loop. And the reason is pretty simple, and that is because it's ungraspable. Well, we're going to go to that place today that is ungraspable. It's ungraspable, but it is possible to experience that ungraspable nature. It's impossible to grasp it, but if we don't try to grasp it, we can't experience it. So we'll be doing that today. Okay? Now, something that you need to know, in order to look at certain aspects of the self, what I'm going to do is I'm going to give them labels, artificial labels, names, that I have found work. I will choose a label or a name, and I will ask you if I may speak to that voice. Now, this comes from a technique called voice dialogue, which was discovered by Hal and Sidra Stone, who are two psychotherapists who I studied with back in 1983-84 for a year. And this is what led me, through my Zen training, to come up with the big mind experience. So the first part of this is going to be very similar to voice dialogue, except they never work with groups. They work one-on-one because it's more psychological oriented. This I'm not doing for psychological reasons. My purpose is to help you have an experience of the transcendent. I will use some of the therapeutic voices just to lay a foundation for you, so that when we move beyond the self, you have a firm foundation. Because we do not want to build a structure on a poor foundation. Okay? We could go to the last part of this workshop now, and you can all have the transcendent experience, and you'll kind of float out of here, or wobble out of here and go, what just hit me? So I'm going to lay some foundation so that it is not quite as shocking. So what you need to know is, when I ask to speak to a specific voice in you, what I'd like you to do is shift your position in the chair to where that voice is seated. Now, that voice is seated wherever you shift to. When we make a physical shift, it will facilitate a mental shift. What I'm trying to do is get you used to shifting your perspective. When we stick to one perspective, then our view of life, of reality, is very one-dimensional. It's very narrow. And that's what we're going to be doing with reality. We're going to be looking at different aspects of reality so that we get a better perspective. One of the things that we're going to do is we're going to find out that every voice is like a child in a family. And some children have nice names. And some children, for not their own fault, the parents gave it to them, have horrible names. And those with bad names get treated very badly. In fact, sometimes they get put down in the basement, they get buried, they get smothered, they don't get listened to, and so forth. What we want to do is realize that every voice, every child has a right to be, and a right to be heard. You wouldn't think of locking any of your kids down in the basement and throwing the key away. So as the protector, your job is also to protect these voices and make sure that they're heard. Okay? All right. I'd like to speak now to a close ally of yours, one who you work together as a team. I call you both together the guardians, and that voice is the controller. So may I speak to the voice of the controller? All right, you are? Controller. All right, what is your job? Control.
There's the person that you want to be for your spouse and the person you want to be in the world. I would say self is this very fragmented thing, and we have all these different ideas of what our best, most appropriate self might be for different situations. And there is conflict, because even within ourself, we have our own different needs and different tensions pulling on us in different ways, and so we have to sometimes collide these different aspects of ourselves into a particular performance, and that's why a lot of times, even if we're really trying, it's really hard to perform skillfully in the moment, and we let ourselves down a lot, and we have to kind of rethink who we are in our performance in relationship to other people. And I think all that's very healthy, especially if we work through it in a healthy kind of way.
This is Herman Brooks. Herman is just like the rest of us. Every day he has to make all kinds of decisions, like what to wear, whom to date, and when to panic. Now, these decisions should be easy, but if you take a look inside Herman's head, you'll see why he sometimes has trouble making up his mind.
I'm Herman's intellect. Without me, he couldn't hold his job, pay his rent, or tie his shoes.
I'm Herman's sensitivity. Without me, he wouldn't feel tenderness, honesty, or love. The good things in life.
I'm Herman's anxiety, and I keep him out of trouble. And believe me, there's trouble everywhere.
I'm Herman's lust. Without me, he'd miss out on all the good stuff. You know, fun, food, babes. Sometimes they agree. Usually they don't. But this struggle is going on inside all of us. And it's all going on inside Herman's head.
What is this place?
This is Imagination Land. It's where all the wonderful and goofy things that humans have made up over the years live together.
So very similarly, when Joseph Campbell, the comparative mythologist, is saying something like, all the worlds, all the gods, all the symbols are within us, he's saying that they're magnified dreams, what Carl Jung talks about in his idea of the collective unconscious.
Carl Jung's idea, which he calls the archetypes of the collective unconscious.
What do you mean by archetype?
They are expressions of the structure of the human psyche. All the gods, all the heavens, all the worlds are within us. They are magnified dreams. One can say that the images of myth are reflections of spiritual and depth potentialities of every one of us. Through contemplating those, we evoke those powers in our own lives. And to see life as a poem and yourself participating in a poem is what the myth does for you. Every mythology, every religion is true in this sense. It is true as metaphorical of the human and cosmic mystery. But when it gets stuck to the metaphor, then you're in trouble.
Kind of like all symbolism, all mythology, all of these things are projections of these inner aspects of ourself. And so who we are as a person is symbolically somewhat related to the idea of having like the tempting devil on one shoulder and the good angel on the other shoulder. I mean, that's kind of a simplistic binary. There is the pull of multiple voices within us, and often that gets represented in cultural symbolism and different archetypes like Jesus or the devil or Buddha and Maya, the different local symbols. But Joseph Campbell would say that all of that relates back to this inner archetypal struggle within ourself, and a lot of it has to do with different organs of the body that want different things. Certain parts of you want to have sex, certain part of you want food, and then, you know, the social pressure put on you from above, like we're talking about before with Holons and the rhizomatic contagion, the different pressures coming together to create this event. That's what the self is. So the archetypes in our mind are the symbolic representations of the forces from above and below that put pressure on us to create ourselves. And when I say above and below, I don't mean necessarily good and bad, because there's the unhealthy and healthy versions of both.
Don't you get it? If the terrorists blow that barrier, all the most evil things ever imagined are gonna pour out and take over Imagination Land. Oh no!
There's the unhealthy versions of nature, the unhealthy versions of ego and hunger and greed and lust and all that, but there's the healthy versions of giving into nature as well. And there are the healthy archetypes of structure, the healthy father and the unhealthy father archetypes. And we as the hero have to navigate this territory. This is what a lot of mythology is about.
Only you can help us win this battle.
But the problem is that most people, not only do they take their own self literally, but they take all of these symbols literally. And so they are literally having an interior spiritual battle. Jesus and the devil are fighting it out within them all the time, or whatever the cultural equivalent is. Whereas somebody who understands the symbolic nature of these things isn't going to take all that stuff so literally. But that doesn't mean that the symbolism still isn't helpful. We just got to get careful not to get too stuck in any symbols. And we also have to be careful to look at the symbols that we disregard, because like Gimpo Roshi was saying before, we don't want to throw any of these kids away. We need to see that all of these voices within us are trying to say something, and we need to give them all their place and their healthy due. So speaking of what's been rejected or demonized, I have another video that talks about how some of the later satanic themes pick up the rejected archetypes of Christianity as a way to reclaim the value that Christianity has rejected. My video is about religious symbolism and non-dual synthesis, and it talks about how through taking into account these different extreme perspectives, we can find a middle position or synthesis within yourself. Again, check for links down below. Like, for example, Joseph Campbell would say that symbolically, a demon is a repressed and denied energy within us that hasn't been given its due, so it shows up in some kind of horrible, ugly, demonic way. I'll give you an example of that. These priests who molest little boys, they don't have a healthy, sanctified, God-glorified way to express some of their lower energies, so it just gets repressed and pushed down and ignored, and then when it finally does bubble up, because it doesn't have any good way to come up, it only comes up as this horrible, evil, fucked up thing. That's a demon. That's why it's important to make sure that all of these things are paid their dues, that we listen to all of these voices within ourselves, and that we don't take it literally and get caught up in these simple binaries, accepting and rejecting. And if the self is just a result of these forces from top down and bottom up, and we're kind of just this thrown object into reality where we never consciously began, but we just kind of like woke up in it. How can there be something like free will? Where does that come from when we're constantly viewing every new experience through lenses that have been given to us to look through? Anyways, you can see how deep this rabbit hole goes in different directions. So we could talk about religion and mythology. We could talk about free will versus determinism. And we could take that further still into this area of ethics and how that might relate to our justice system. So this video is going to try to stay more focused towards what is the self, what is the soul, what are the different ideas around that relate to it, what is this self-transcendence, what happens after I die, what are the possibilities of something like reincarnation or heaven, these ideas. And that's it. If you want to see a video about something more, hit me up down in the underneath comments, and I'll either link you to someone else's video, or maybe you'll inspire me to make a new video. Alright, moving on. Think about this character from Lord of the Rings, Gollum. I mean, I can understand why you wouldn't want to, but think about it for a second. There is something terrible and horrible and ugly about Gollum, and we're all grossed out by him. Yet in the story of the Lord of the Rings, Frodo has compassion for Gollum because he knows what it's like to carry the Ring of Power. He has compassion for Gollum because he sees the Gollum in himself. So even though he himself doesn't want to be like that, he also knows that to some extent he is. And so he has to own the Gollum within himself. So this is one of the major themes of mythology. The hero goes into the labyrinth and slays the Minotaur or his inner beast, or slays the dragon in the cave. But in this case, in this story, the hero has mercy on this tragic figure. And that's a variation on the theme as well.
Wait. You don't have any friends. Nobody likes you.
Not listening. I'm not listening.
You're a liar. And a thief.
No.
Murderer.
This idea is really important. Think about what Gollum just said. It can be really, really hard to change the narrative. People fall into patterns, and they can think of their current self in terms of their past self, victims now to who they have been in the past. And the really great thing about some of these religious traditions is they offer a person a chance to start over. Sometimes a fresh start and some forgiveness and death to the past and a rebirth into the new future is what a lot of us are really looking for. A way to forgive ourselves and move on, a way to be born again. And I can tell you, you don't need to come to Jesus to be able to do that right now. All you have to do
is let the past go and decide how you want to move on and do better, create a new self. And we're going to talk about some different non-superstitious ways of doing this and talking about it. And basically, to some extent, what we're doing would be creating new archetypes and projecting into them and creating them and fleshing them out as well. And yeah, you might still have some karmic residue or some past stuff that haunts you from your past life, but you can choose who you're going to be. You can choose how to move forward. You can make you. The self is an illusion. So why not be the creator of yourself as an artist? Refine yourself, get better over time, instead of being the victim to your past. This is a great way we can move forward.
The self is an illusion, the sense of being an ego, an I, a thinker of thoughts in addition to the thoughts, an experiencer in addition to the experience. The sense that we all have of riding around inside our heads as a passenger in the vehicle of the body. That's where most people start when they think about any of these questions. Most people don't feel identical to their bodies. They feel like they have bodies. They feel like they're inside the body, and most people feel like they're inside their heads. Now, that sense of being a subject, a locus of consciousness inside the head, is an illusion. That is, it makes no neuroanatomical sense. There's no place in the brain for your ego to be hiding. We know that we have a changing system. We are a process. And there's not one unitary self that's carried through from one moment to the next, unchanging. And yet we feel that we have this self that's just this kind of center of experience. Now it's possible, I claim, and people have claimed for thousands of years, to lose this feeling, to actually have the center drop out of experience. So that rather than feeling like you're on this side of things looking in, so you're almost looking over your own shoulder, appropriating experience in each moment, you can just be identical to this sphere of experience that is all of the color and light and feeling and energy of consciousness, but there's no sense of center there. So this is classically described as self-transcendence or ego-transcendence in spiritual, mystical, New Age, religious literature. It is, in large measure, the baby in the bathwater that religious people are afraid to throw out. If you want to take seriously the project of being like Jesus or Buddha, or whatever your favorite contemplative is, self-transcendence really is at the core of the phenomenology that is described there. And it's a real experience. It's clearly an experience that people can have. And while it tells you nothing about the cosmos, it tells you nothing about what happened before the Big Bang, it doesn't make religious dogmas any more plausible, it does tell you something about the nature of human consciousness. And the problem with religion is that people extrapolate from those experiences and make grandiose claims about the nature of the universe. But it just so happens that this experience of self-transcendence does link up with what we know about the mind through neuroscience to form a plausible connection between science and classic mysticism, classic spirituality. Because if you lose your sense of a unitary self, if you lose your sense that there's a permanent, unchanging center to consciousness, your experience of the world actually becomes more faithful to the facts. It's not a distortion of the way we think things are at the level of the brain. It actually brings your experience into closer register with how we think things are.
All right, well, we really have put a lot on the table, so let's just try to refresh real quick. We've talked about the blanket and how all of reality is this kind of unfolding fractal process, this holarchy of holons, if you will, on the exterior. And on the interior, there's the collective unconscious. There's this realm of a bunch of different archetypes, or all these layers or aspects of the self. I want to move forward and talk about what some transformative archetypes might look like. This idea of the higher self, the authentic self, the unique self, and maybe a couple more. But before we get too into that, I want to talk about psychology and more of the interior self-talk that happens. Earlier in the video, Kevin and I mentioned George Herbert Mead and the way that self is constructed through language and through narrative, and the way that we can start to have a concept of self, like yourself is almost like a person you know, like a character in your mind. And then think back to what was happening with Gollum, where he was having this kind of inner conflict between the person that he's known himself to be in the past and the person who he would like to see himself as and who he would want to be in the future, this kind of internal conflict. So most psychological issues have something to do with, or can be at least dealt with, in terms of these archetypes within yourself and within the collective. That's why it's good to analyze your dreams, as well as it also might be interesting to analyze the mythologies that cultures perpetuate. There's a YouTube channel called Bipolar or Waking Up, and this guy's doing a lot of really good work where he has correlated schizophrenia to lower stages of development. That's where you don't have a firm sense of self and you kind of filter through all these different archetypes that you might have in yourself. And a lot of those ruptures and archetypes can be made around particular traumas in your own development, and selves can get fractured off at those stages and then re-traumatized along the way and stuff like that. And then bipolar disorder is more like what we're seeing in Gollum, where there's this kind kind of split personality between these two archetypes within oneself that are in conflict, and the self kind of goes back and forth between the both, and there needs to be some kind of a healthy assimilation. In the video, this guy argues that once you get to a higher stage of development, you're more able to disidentify with a lot of this mental action and deal with it more skillfully. So as you take on more and more perspectives and your mind is able to deal with more and more factors, you're more and more capable of being able to deal with the complexities that are going on in your interiors. Again, check down below for links.
All right, now we've really opened up a can of worms, because now we're talking about stages of development and states. And there is a lot more going on in this realm of psychology than just this realm of the archetypes of the collective unconscious. There are personality types and particular areas of knowledge and skill, and there are also states of consciousness which do have the psychological aspect but also have a biochemical aspect. But what I started to talk about was this idea of stages of development. And one of my favorite developmental systems is called spiral dynamics, but there are many other developmental systems, and it's good to look at all of them and understand what the overarching patterns are. I would share a link up here like this, but apparently we can't do annotations anymore, so again, check for links down below. One of the distinctions that might be helpful that we can kind of quickly make is this idea between pre-conventional, conventional, and post-conventional stages. So in other words, there's a time in everyone's development before they're indoctrinated into culture and society, and then once they get indoctrinated into culture and society, and then some people deconstruct and reconstruct the cultural narrative. So that's a pre-conventional, conventional, and post-conventional. As the individual moves through stages of development, both culturally and individually through time and history and in one's own life, we take into account more and more factors in our reasoning. We extend our care further and further to include more people, and cognitively, we include more and more factors. And so if you think about it, a pre-conventional concept of the self probably doesn't even have a concept of self. Like a baby covers its eyes and thinks the world disappears. It takes time for an ego to even develop, for a concept of self to even be developed. And then for a long time, people are kind of victims to this concept that they've been indoctrinated into. And it does take time for people to kind of grow out of that and see through it, if they ever even do. A lot of people don't. But these stages of development, they have a lot to do with waking up. And waking up and growing up is one of the next things that we're going to be talking about here.
So in terms of free will and determinism, you can notice that earlier I said something about how can you hold people accountable when we know that we're just these kinds of thrown objects that are seeing things through these perspectives that are heavily conditioned through nature and nurture. And yet I'm also inviting people to change their lives, right?
I've learned my lesson, sir. I see now what I've never seen before. I'm cured. Praise God.
So I think both are true. We do have a lot of programming, and that's why Christianity and some of these other traditions can be so helpful, is because they are these programs that are beneficial for transformation. So even just having that as a code in your mind that you can do this, this is how it's done, this is the process through which you go through to be able to do it, that helps you to be able to create yourself in that way. So it is only through having the programming and the conditioning that one is even able to have a transformation or to change their self or to get there. So to some extent, when we're learning about existentialism or Buddhism or something like that, in part we are transcending cultural conditioning. But the other thing that we're also really doing is expanding our cultural conditioning so it's not so limited. But we at no point have really gotten outside of cultural conditioning. We've just taken on more conditioning. As Sam Harris was talking about, there is this potential for self-transcendence or awakening. And how does this happen? It has to do with this ego and construct awareness that we're talking about. So what I was just saying before about realizing that we're taking on more and more cultural conditioning, that's the construct awareness. And this deconstruction of the self, that's ego awareness. So the real jewel of existentialism is this realization that self is an illusion. And on the other side of that is not this despair and hopelessness and emptiness and meaninglessness, but this realization that you can be the creator of yourself. You can become what you would like. You can turn your life into an art project. You can make yourself a masterpiece. You don't have to be the victim to who you've been in the past. So once we realize that there really is no self in an absolute way, then these other archetypes of self often have been created and projected into in place of falling back into habitual patterns of the self. So there's this idea of the higher self, and the higher self is you at your best.
This is the self that you want to step into when you are really pressured and you feel like, all right, this is the moment. I need to like really summon my best self in this moment. You might call upon your higher self and try to step into that. I can share something from my own personal life experience. When I was going through my divorce at a certain point, it was very heavy, and when normally I would be doing really well and I would even be able to counsel people and give them advice, in this moment, I was just totally wrecked. And I spent a lot of my time trying to talk with people to occupy my mind in a positive way, because it was happening that my inner self-talk was just habitual and going crazy, and I was having a real hard time controlling it. But in those moments when I had no one to talk to and I was feeling really scared and depressed and alone, I had a conversation with my higher self. I did big mind practice and I switched back and forth and I started to let these voices talk to each other. And it really helped me to gain insight and to get some perspective and to get clarity and to move on. So I definitely know from my own personal experience that having these tools in your belt, knowing how to dissect the self, knowing how to call upon some of these different voices can be really helpful in your own life, in your own practice, in the world with other people. Remember before we talked about this idea of the blanket, it's all the blanket, seeing the universe as one unfolding process that we're all a part of. Well, a lot of people take this perspective and they go to the far extreme of it, and that can lead to what we call spiritual bypassing, or using spiritual ideas to bypass the real circumstances of life, to the point where people are just like, it's all the blanket, there are no problems, and that's not really helpful.
Spiritual bypassing means using spiritual practices and or beliefs to avoid dealing with painful situations in our lives, emotional challenges, developmental tasks, and rationalizing that avoidance with spiritual language. So I call it, in shorthand, dissociation and holy drag. And it can be very subtle. It can range from claiming that we're all creating our reality, and if we're sick, that's because we've drawn it to us, we use magical thinking, to the most sophisticated types of meditative practice where one can dissociate from certain states and think that one is simply observing them dispassionately. When in fact, we're so removed, we're cut off. We've become dry. Our spirituality's become desiccated. So it basically means avoidance in spiritual robes, spiritualized avoidance. And it's very prevalent.
It's very common.
And when I started to write it, I realized I had to write about misuse of compassion, the demonizing of anger, confrontation phobia, shame, premature transcendence, getting really negative about our negativity. It just went on and on. It was like opening a can of worms, but I'm glad I opened it.
And it's really, it's not something for people to be ashamed of. It's what we all do. We all do this to a certain degree as we go along the spiritual path. And with our own evolving, it's just there. So it's more, here's how it works, here's what it is, here's an invitation to take a look at how to stop avoiding.
To outgrow it. Not to make it wrong, but to meet the place in us that is prone to that, which is the exact same place that wants to be distracted from any sort of suffering. And to meet it, and to truly do what's needed to outgrow it. Because without that, we're not really engaged in spiritual practice. We are doing something that is a surrogate of it. And that keeps us cut off from what we really could have if we were to engage in spiritual practice fully. People who realize they've reached enough maturity to get that there's some things that spiritual practice cannot touch. The psychological work, psychotherapeutic work can touch, especially in conjunction with spiritual practice. So what we're pointing to here is a truly psycho-spiritual approach to healing and awakening, which is our work in essence, psycho-spiritual work, integrative work.
And then on the other side, we've mentioned this idea of the cancer of the individual disconnected from the process, and that's not really helpful either. But like Robert Master said, there are things that psychology can touch that religious ideas just can't touch, that they just wind up avoiding. But then on the other hand, we can go too deep into psychology where we're just constantly meditating on how we're this damaged child. So there arises this problem: to what extent do we focus on ourself in terms of our psychology and our hurt, damaged child self, and to what extent do we focus on being the blanket and living in that truth? And I do think there is actually a good answer to this. In general, I think it is good to live in the blanket realization. But on the other hand, when problems arise, when we have a hard time seeing ourselves in another person, and we feel a whole bunch of negative energy arise within us, that's a good time to do some shadow work. That's a good time to take a look at yourself and realize what aspects of your own psychology might be blocking your ability ability to really be open and honest and loving and fluid with another person. That's when psychology becomes really necessary. If there is a baby in the bathwater to be had in Scientology or Dianetics, it probably is this concept of being clear. They hook people up to these machines and they'd ask them a bunch of questions, and they check the correlation of their biological response to when they would talk about a subject, and they would keep talking with them about the subject until their biological response stopped, and they correlated that to an interior dealing with that repressed archetype. That's a type of shadow work. It's a type of thinking about the things that upset you and how that might relate to yourself, and how you can, in some sense, assimilate that and move on, so that way you can be clear. So I think it's good to spend a good amount of the majority of the acting parts of your day within the creative projections of your higher self. But when shadow arises, you have to deal with it. You can't just push it down and ignore it, otherwise it just gets bigger and bigger, and it becomes that repressed demon that wants to get its due. The more you push it down, the bigger and the worse it gets. So there's this idea of non-dual perspective, and this is where you're able to hold both truths at once, where you're able to hold that blanket truth with you in the day-to-day life, but also engage in the world. And hopefully when you engage, it's not from that victim perspective, it's from the realization of that blanket self, that big picture self. This reminds me of in Christianity, where they talk about how we're all hands and feet of the body of Christ, how our body is a temple, and how we can die to our flesh, crucify our ego, and live as the hands and feet for love in the world as God to each other. That is the type of spiritual practice that we want to hold on to in this kind of non-dual perspective. And so there are two different selves that we can keep in mind when we're talking about this non-dual perspective. There's that blanket self, which is often called the authentic self. When we're talking about the authentic self, we're talking about like what Sam Harris is talking about, where he's saying that this is more in line with what science really knows about who and what we actually are. That one without a second, that all is one, that is the authentic self. That is who and what we truly are. So Andrew Cohen talks about this idea of the authentic self, and he talks about it in the context of evolutionary enlightenment. And there's also evolutionary Christianity. This whole idea of evolutionary spirituality is this postmodern integral understanding of spirituality where we are the hands and feet of evolution in the world. Now Andrew Cohen himself, he does think of it in an idealistic way, where he thinks that there is some kind of a being of beings or consciousness before the Big Bang who is taking on this project of creating and becoming the world. I think it's beautiful poetry, but I think the truth of our unity is in our inter-objective connection in the blanket, in the big picture unfolding process of objective unity, E equals MC squared, that all matter is just one vibrating field of energy. The unity that I'm talking about is not some kind of intersubjective, we're all a part of the same consciousness. But I do think that's an interesting poetic way of talking about it, because we all are indoctrinated into the same language games, so there is an intersubjective aspect to it. There is the relative nature of symbols, which means related to. But it's interesting to hear Andrew Cohen talking about the authentic self in terms of evolution in action, this passionate drive to create and become more, to be more skillful, to be better, to be more awake, to be more alive, to push the boundaries further. It's beautiful. It's inspiring.
If we ever meet a truly inspired or passionate or gifted or talented engineer, artist, poet, scientist, spiritual teacher, public servant, but an individual who is passionately committed to creating something new, in their presence one will feel a sense of ecstatic urgency. I must do this. All these individuals are committed to making manifest these potentials that are just at the verge of entering into the present, and they see them and they feel them. You know, they see and they feel these potentials, and they feel that ecstatically committed to giving them birth. So the ecstatic urgency that we feel as the sexual impulse, and the ecstatic urgency that deeply creative geniuses experience, is at the highest level experience is the spiritual impulse, and the spiritual impulse is the urge towards consciousness, the desire to become more conscious, the mysteriously felt urge to become more conscious. I must become more conscious. I feel, I have to, I must. And we say, well, where does that come from? In a secular culture where our values are fundamentally materialistic and narcissistic, where could such a strong compulsion comes from? Well, it comes from the very process that made it possible for us to have the experience right now. And so that the leading edge of that original intention to create a material universe is when a human being experiences this mysteriously felt compulsion towards consciousness. I must evolve. symbolic level of consciousness. I must become more conscious. So that experience is what the authentic self is. The higher we is when any two or more individuals awaken to the consciousness of this authentic self in the same time and in the same place. Because the authentic self, or the urge to become more conscious, this passionately felt ecstatic sense of urgency, is egoless. So when I awaken to that state of consciousness and that future-oriented compulsion that's not personal, and you would awaken to that future-oriented compulsion that's not personal, we experience what's called intersubjective non-duality. Intersubjective means between subjects. It's the shared space between individuals. And what we experience in this state is there are no ego boundaries. So there would be a sense that there's literally nothing between us, that we are in fact one being, one consciousness, while at the same time and in the same space are recognizing and appreciating the fact that we are actually two different people. And it's a paradox and it's a contradiction. But in the experience, we experience both at the same time. And in the experience, there isn't any contradiction. It's simply true that we are absolutely one, and at the same time we are different. And this makes it possible for us to share a sense of intimacy and communion and trust and also creative engagement that's absolutely impossible in any other kind of circumstance.
This second aspect of the self that I want to talk about is called the unique self, which has to do with our own unique skills and knowledge and ability that has to do with being this particular embodiment of that universe in flux, or that process in flux. So if we can hold both of those at once, this authentic realization of the absolute unity of all things, as well as our relative unique perspective with our own skills and insights and whatnot, hold both of these truths at once, then we can really act skillfully in the world as who and what we truly are.
Now you have to come here and do... Okay.
All right, that's good.
We're the same. It's all the blanket, so...
There you go. Give it a shot.
That is wonderful, Albert.
Oh, honey, he's got it.
So from there's all these ideas about karma yoga. Karma means action. So that means turning every single one of your actions into a spiritual practice. And this goes back to what Joseph Campbell was saying about seeing your life as a poem, and seeing your life as art and a masterpiece, seeing yourself as a creation, as an artistic project. So if you suck as a person, then maybe you suck as an artist.
Now you see your potential, young creator. But there's still much more we need from you.
Maybe what you really need to do is take creative control over this and stop being a victim and blaming everyone else for how all this is happening to you, and start owning it. That's not to say people aren't really in bad, shitty situations, or that we're not victims of circumstance or something like that. But you can only control what you can do at the end of the day. You control you. So I would encourage you to do the best you can do, to make the best you can be, to be your best, to be your highest self, to step into that every day. Today, I'm gonna be my highest self. I'm gonna hold that non-dual perspective, be the hands and feet of evolution, of love, of God to other people in the world. And our goal would be to engage with them skillfully where they are, help them with whatever it is that they need where they're at, as opposed to letting our ego or our concept of self and our own issues and all these kinds of things get in the way of us really being of service to other people. Now, I mentioned that word ego. I feel like that is kind of a loaded term, and it's got a lot of confusion around it, so let me try to clear that up real quick before we move on. Usually it has something to do with the more traditional Christian pride before the fall, or in terms of the Eastern traditions, these Enlightenment traditions like Buddhism and Hinduism and things like that, ego is a separate self-concept. That's really relating back to what I'm talking about of this idea of the individual as a type of cancer. And in the West, when we talk about ego, what we're really saying is any conception of a self. So like in psychology or something, when they're talking about developing a healthy ego, they're talking about developing the most healthy concept of self as possible. So someone like Ken Wilber, the American integral philosopher, would say something like, the problem is that most people's ego is not big enough. It's identified with this puny little body mind when it should be identified with the cosmos. When we're talking about ego, generally the problem has to do with this conception of a limited self, not any conception of self at all, because one could have an enlightened ego, enlightened meaning aware of this unity and interconnection between all things. That's what every tradition is generally awakening to, is this fundamental unity and interconnectedness. And that's what we're getting at here. As Sam said before, that's the real diamond in the dunghill. That's the real baby from this dirty bathwater that religious people are afraid to throw out, and that we all should be integrating into our daily life. This new kind of way of talking about our relationship with life and reality. Another thing we talk about in integral philosophy is this idea of the first, second, and third person perspective perspectives of God, seeing God in first, second, and third person perspective. In this regard, this word God just means sacred. So that's another way of saying, I'm sacred, you're sacred, everything is sacred.
We're the same. It's all the blanket, so...
So that's more of an attitude about how we should live together than it is a unfounded or superstitious belief. It's just a way to decide to be. And it's one I would invite you to. So stick around. What we're going to talk about next is ghosts and heaven and reincarnation.
Thanks so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed this, please check out the full-length video and like and subscribe.